Picture this. A retired teacher stands in front of a packed courtroom, holding up a stack of photographs while the HOA president's face turns crimson with embarrassment. The judge looks down from the bench and delivers the line that would become legendary in their neighborhood. "Don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining." The entire gallery erupts in nervous laughter, but what led to this moment of public humiliation was 3 years of the most petty, vindictive, and downright absurd HOA warfare you've ever heard. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness how one woman's refusal to bow down to neighborhood tyrants led to the most satisfying courtroom victory in HOA history. This isn't just about property disputes or garden gnomes. This is about what happens when power-hungry neighbors push the wrong person too far, and how their own lies eventually became the rope they hung themselves with. What you're about to hear will make you question every HOA rule you've ever encountered, and trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why Margaret Chen became known as the woman who single-handedly exposed the most corrupt homeowners association in the county. Margaret Chen had always been the type of person who believed in doing things the right way. After 32 years of teaching high school English, she'd developed an eye for detail that bordered on obsessive and a spine made of steel when it came to standing up for what was right. When she and her husband David retired to Willowbrook Estates in 2019, they thought they'd found their slice of suburban paradise. Willowbrook Estates wasn't just any subdivision. It was one of those meticulously planned communities where every mailbox looked identical, every lawn was perfectly manicured, and every house followed the same architectural guidelines down to the approved paint colors. The HOA fees were steep at $400 a month, but the amenities seemed worth it. A community pool, tennis courts, walking trails, and the promise of maintained property values. The Chens had done their homework before buying their corner lot on Maple Ridge Drive. They'd read through the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, all 47 pages of them. They'd attended a board meeting as prospective buyers, smiled politely at the current residents, and even met with Patricia Williamson, the HOA president, who gave them a walking tour of the neighborhood while pointing out all the wonderful community standards that kept their property values high. Patricia Williamson was exactly the type of person you'd expect to find running an HOA with an iron fist. In her mid-50s, she had the kind of blonde hair that required weekly salon visits and the sort of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd been living in Willowbrook Estates since its inception in 2003 and had served on the HOA board for 12 of those 16 years, the last 6 as president. Her husband was a successful insurance adjuster, which meant she had plenty of time to dedicate to what she called maintaining community excellence. But here's where things get interesting, and trust me, you're going to want to remember this detail because it becomes crucial later. Patricia didn't just live in Willowbrook Estates. Her brother-in-law owned the property management company that handled the HOA's finances, and her nephew ran the landscaping service that maintained all the common areas. This cozy family arrangement had been flying under the radar for years, generating a steady stream of income that kept certain bank accounts very healthy. The first few months were blissful for Margaret and David. They settled into their new home, a beautiful colonial with a corner lot that gave them slightly more yard space than their neighbors. Margaret planted a small garden in the back corner of their property, carefully choosing plants that were listed as approved in the HOA guidelines. David set up his workshop in the garage and started volunteering at the community center. They were living the retirement dream. But dreams, as you know, have a way of turning into nightmares when the wrong people have too much power. The trouble started in March 2020, right as the world was shutting down due to the pandemic. Margaret had been working in her garden when she noticed Patricia Williamson walking slowly past their house, phone in hand, clearly taking pictures. It struck her as odd, but she waved politely and went back to her planting. 3 days later, she found the first violation notice in her mailbox. "Unapproved garden structure," the notice read. Section 4.7 of the HOA covenants states that no permanent structures may be erected without prior architectural approval. Fine. $75. Compliance required within 14 days. Margaret stared at the notice in confusion. Garden structure? She walked around to her backyard and looked at her small herb garden. The only thing that could remotely be considered a structure was the small wooden border she'd built around the garden bed. Nothing more than 4 pieces of cedar lumber forming a rectangle about 3 feet by 4 feet, maybe 6 inches high. She'd seen identical garden borders throughout the neighborhood. That evening, she called the HOA management company. After being transferred 3 times, she finally reached someone who could pull up her file. The violation is for an unapproved raised garden bed structure, the representative explained. All structures require pre-approval from the architectural committee. But it's just a border, Margaret protested. I've seen the same thing in dozens of yards in the neighborhood. Ma'am, I can only tell you what's in the report filed by the HOA board. If you'd like to dispute the violation, you'll need to request a hearing. Margaret hung up, frustrated but not yet alarmed. She'd simply request a hearing, explain the situation, and get this ridiculous fine reversed. After all, she was dealing with reasonable neighbors, right? Wrong. Hold on, because what happened next is where this story really starts to get unbelievable. You see, Margaret had no idea that she'd already been marked as a target, and that simple garden border was just the first move in a chess game she didn't even know she was playing. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later in the community clubhouse. Margaret prepared thoroughly, printing out photos of similar garden borders throughout the neighborhood, and bringing her copy of the HOA covenants with the relevant sections highlighted. She arrived 15 minutes early to find Patricia Williamson and 2 other board members, Robert Hayes and Jennifer Martinez, seated at a folding table with a small stack of manila folders. "Mrs. Chen," Patricia said with that practiced smile, "please have a seat. We appreciate you taking the time to address this violation." Margaret presented her case methodically. She showed the photos of identical garden borders in other yards, pointed out that her structure was temporary and could be easily removed, and noted that the HOA guidelines were unclear about what constituted a structure requiring approval. The board members listened politely, occasionally nodding, but Margaret noticed they kept glancing at each other with looks that seemed almost amused. When she finished her presentation, Patricia cleared her throat. "Mrs. Chen, we appreciate your thoroughness, but the violation stands. Your garden border is clearly a permanent structure, and regardless of what other residents may have in their yards, you failed to seek proper approval. However, we're willing to reduce the fine to $50 if you remove the structure immediately." "But what about all the other identical structures I photographed?" Margaret asked. "Those will be addressed separately as we become aware of them," Robert Hayes chimed in. "Each violation is handled on a case-by-case basis." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the way he said, "as we become aware of them," suggested that the board had been very much aware of the other garden borders, but had chosen to target her specifically. But why? She paid the reduced fine and removed the garden border, thinking that would be the end of it. But as any of you who've dealt with petty tyrants know, showing weakness only encourages more aggression. 2 weeks later, another violation notice appeared in her mailbox. The second violation notice was for improper waste container placement. According to the citation, Margaret had placed her trash cans at the curb 12 hours before pickup, a violation of Section 8.3, which stated that containers could only be placed curbside after 6 p.m. the evening before collection. The fine was $50, and the notice included a photograph timestamp showing her garbage cans at the curb at 6:17 a.m. on collection day. Margaret was baffled. She had placed the cans out the night before, just as she'd done for months without issue. But more troubling was the photograph itself. It was taken from an angle that suggested someone had been standing in her driveway or very close to her property line. The timestamp showed 6:17 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. Who was prowling around her house, taking photographs at dawn? She started paying closer attention to her surroundings and began to notice things that should have been obvious earlier. Patricia Williamson's house was 2 streets over, but she seemed to walk past Margaret's corner lot with unusual frequency. Sometimes she was walking a small white dog, sometimes she was allegedly jogging, and sometimes she appeared to be having phone conversations that required her to pace back and forth in front of Margaret's house. Margaret decided to test her growing suspicion. The following Wednesday, she made a point of placing her trash cans at the curb at exactly 6:02 p.m. the evening before collection, taking a photo with her phone to timestamp the placement. She then got up early and watched from her kitchen window. At 6:15 a.m., Patricia Williamson appeared at the end of her street, walking slowly while talking on her phone. She paused directly in front of Margaret's house, raised her phone, and took several photographs of the trash cans. Then she continued on her way. Margaret felt her teacher instincts kicking in, the same instincts that had helped her catch cheating students for 3 decades. This wasn't about maintaining community standards. This was targeted harassment. But the third violation notice proved that Patricia Williamson was playing a much more sophisticated game than simple harassment. The notice arrived on a Friday afternoon in April, just as Margaret was getting ready to leave for her weekly grocery shopping trip. Unauthorized vehicle parking, the citation read. Section 6.4 prohibits commercial vehicles from being parked in residential driveways overnight. Fine, $100. Vehicle must be removed immediately. Commercial vehicle? Margaret looked out at her driveway where her husband's pickup truck sat parked. David had driven that same Ford F-150 to work for 15 years before retiring. It had no commercial markings, no equipment racks, nothing that would indicate commercial use. It was simply a personal pickup truck. She called the management company immediately, but it was after hours, so she left a voicemail. David, meanwhile, had walked outside to examine his truck, looking for anything that might have triggered the violation. "Honey," he called from the driveway, "come look at this." Margaret joined him beside the truck. David was pointing to the rear bumper, where someone had placed a small magnetic sign that read, "Chen Handyman Services" in professional lettering. "I've never seen this before in my life," David said, peeling the magnet off the bumper. "Someone put this on my truck." Margaret felt the bottom of her stomach drop out. Someone had deliberately placed a fake commercial sign on their vehicle to create a violation. This wasn't just harassment. This was entrapment, and it was probably illegal. She spent the weekend researching HOA laws and discovered that her state had specific provisions against retaliatory enforcement and discriminatory targeting by homeowners associations. But she also learned that proving such targeting was extremely difficult, requiring documentation of disparate treatment and evidence of malicious intent. Margaret decided it was time to go on the offensive. She started by filing a formal complaint with the management company, detailing the pattern of violations and the planted sign incident. She demanded an investigation into the HOA board's enforcement practices and requested copies of all violation notices issued in the past year for comparison. The management company's response was swift and predictable. They sided completely with the HOA board. The customer service manager, Linda Martinez, who Margaret later discovered was Jennifer Martinez's sister-in-law, sent a terse email stating that the violations were valid, the fines would stand, and any further frivolous complaints would be forwarded to the HOA's legal counsel. But here's where Margaret's teaching background became a serious advantage. She knew how to research, document, and build a case methodically. If the HOA wanted to play hardball, she was more than ready. And trust me, what she uncovered next will blow your mind, because it turns out that the fake commercial sign incident was just the tip of an iceberg of corruption that went much deeper than anyone imagined. Margaret started her investigation by walking through the entire neighborhood with a camera, documenting every potential violation she could find. Garden borders identical to her original one, trash cans left out past collection time, commercial-style vehicles in driveways, unapproved door decorations, mailbox modifications. She found dozens of violations that had apparently escaped the board's notice. But more interestingly, she started to notice a pattern in whose properties were always pristine and whose seemed to get away with obvious violations. Board members' houses, their immediate neighbors, and certain long-term residents operate under different rules than everyone else. Patricia Williamson's house, for example, had a decorative fence around her pool area that was clearly higher than the 6-foot maximum specified in the covenants. Robert Hayes had been parking a work van with company logos in his driveway for months. Jennifer Martinez had installed landscape lighting that violated the architectural guidelines restrictions on exterior illumination. But the real smoking gun came when Margaret decided to attend the monthly HOA board meetings as a regular observer. The meetings were held on the second Tuesday of each month in the community clubhouse, ostensibly open to all residents but rarely attended by more than 3 or 4 homeowners. Margaret started showing up in May 2020, sitting quietly in the back and taking careful notes. What she witnessed was a masterclass in petty authoritarianism and financial impropriety. The board operated like a closed family business, with Patricia running meetings with barely concealed contempt for any resident concerns. When homeowner questions were raised, they were dismissed with bureaucratic double talk or deferred to committee review that never seemed to result in any actual review. But the financial reports were where things got really interesting. The HOA was spending enormous amounts on landscaping, nearly double what comparable communities typically spent. The management fees were also suspiciously high, and there were regular consultation fees paid to various family members for services that seemed unnecessary or overpriced. Margaret started connecting the dots. The landscaping company that received the lion's share of HOA funds was owned by Patricia's nephew. The management company charging premium rates was run by Patricia's brother-in-law. Even the law firm the HOA used for legal matters was the same firm that handled Patricia's family's business affairs. This wasn't just about power trips and harassment. This was about money, and lots of it. Margaret realized she was dealing with a conspiracy that had been running for years, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in profits for Patricia Williamson's extended family, while homeowners paid inflated fees and lived under increasingly arbitrary enforcement of rules that seemed to apply differently depending on who you were. But Margaret had one more card to play, and it was going to change everything. She started documenting not just the violations and the financial irregularities, but also the surveillance and harassment patterns. She set up her own cameras, tracking Patricia's unusual walking patterns past her house. She recorded the times and dates of every suspicious incident, and she began reaching out to other homeowners who might have experienced similar targeting. What she discovered was that the Chens weren't the only ones being systematically harassed. At least 6 other families had experienced sudden spikes in violation notices, always following some minor disagreement with board decisions or questions about HOA finances. Several long-term residents had been forced to move away after sustained campaigns of petty violations and escalating penalties. Margaret was building a federal case for discriminatory enforcement and HOA board corruption, but she needed one final piece of evidence that would be impossible to deny or explain away. And that's when she decided to set a trap that would expose everything. Margaret's plan was elegant in its simplicity, and it relied on Patricia Williamson's own arrogance and predictable behavior patterns. In early June 2020, Margaret and David staged what appeared to be a casual conversation in their front yard about their plans to install a small decorative fountain near their mailbox. They spoke loudly enough for anyone walking by to hear, mentioning specific details about the fountain design, the installation date, and how excited they were about this surprise addition to their landscaping. They had this conversation on a Tuesday evening, knowing that Patricia typically took her evening dog walk past their house around 7 p.m. Sure enough, Patricia appeared right on schedule, slowing her pace as she passed their yard and clearly listening to every word. Margaret then spent the next 3 days researching the exact specifications for decorative fountains in the HOA covenants. What she found was a loophole that would become the key to everything. Decorative water features under 30 inches in height and requiring no permanent plumbing modifications were specifically exempted from architectural approval requirements, provided they met certain aesthetic guidelines. She purchased a beautiful 28-inch solar fountain that met every single specification in the HOA rules, installed it exactly where she'd discussed in her staged conversation, and waited. The violation notice appeared in her mailbox within 48 hours. Unapproved water feature installation, the citation read. Section 4.7 requires architectural approval for all water features. Fine, $150. Structure must be removed within 72 hours, or daily fines will commence at $25 per day. But this time, Margaret was ready with something Patricia Williamson never expected: a lawyer. Margaret had spent weeks researching attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes, and had found Sarah Rodriguez, a sharp civil rights lawyer who had successfully prosecuted several cases involving HOA board corruption. Sarah had reviewed Margaret's documentation and agreed that the pattern of violations, the financial irregularities, and the planted commercial sign incident constituted grounds for both civil and potentially criminal charges. Sarah's response to the fountain violation was swift and devastating. She filed a formal legal challenge to the citation, demanding a proper hearing with full board representation and detailed documentation of the violation. But more importantly, she also filed a discovery motion seeking access to all HOA financial records, board meeting minutes, vendor contracts, and enforcement records for the past 3 years. Patricia Williamson's response revealed just how deep the corruption ran and how panicked she was becoming. Instead of scheduling a simple hearing to address the fountain violation, Patricia called an emergency board meeting and attempted to pass a series of amendments to the HOA covenants that would have banned water features entirely, increased violation fines to $500, and given the board power to place liens on properties without formal hearings. But here's where Margaret's months of building relationships with other homeowners paid off spectacularly. The emergency meeting, which Patricia had scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, assuming minimal attendance, was packed with over 40 residents. Margaret had spent weeks quietly talking to neighbors, sharing her research about the financial improprieties, and building a coalition of homeowners who were fed up with arbitrary enforcement and escalating fees. What happened at that meeting became legendary in the community. Patricia opened by attempting to rush through the proposed amendments without discussion, but she was immediately challenged by multiple homeowners demanding explanations for the sudden rule changes. When she tried to dismiss their questions, Sarah Rodriguez stood up and announced that she was representing the Chens in a legal challenge to the HOA board's conduct. "Mrs. Williamson," Sarah said in a voice that carried across the packed room, "my clients have documented a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement, financial irregularities involving your family members' businesses, and what appears to be deliberate harassment. We're prepared to file both civil and criminal complaints if these matters aren't addressed immediately." The room went completely silent. Patricia's face went through several color changes before settling on a shade of red that matched her fingernails. "I don't know what you're implying," Patricia stammered, "but this board has always operated with complete transparency and fairness." That's when Margaret stood up and delivered the knockout punch. "Mrs. Williamson," she said, her teacher voice carrying perfectly in the silent room, "would you like to explain to your neighbors why your nephew's landscaping company has been paid over $200,000 in HOA funds in the past 18 months, while charging rates that are 40% higher than comparable services?" The gasps and murmurs from the crowd were audible, but Margaret wasn't finished. "Or perhaps you'd like to discuss why your brother-in-law's property management company charges premium rates while providing substandard service? Or maybe you could explain why violation enforcement seems to target homeowners who ask questions about finances while board members and their allies get away with obvious covenant violations." Patricia tried to respond, but Robert Hayes grabbed her arm and whispered something urgent in her ear. Jennifer Martinez was already gathering up the papers in front of her and looking toward the exit. "This meeting is adjourned," Patricia announced abruptly, standing so quickly she knocked over her chair. But the homeowners weren't having it. Voices rose throughout the room, demanding answers, demanding an explanation for the financial irregularities, demanding accountability. That's when Margaret played her final card. "Before you leave," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos, "I think everyone should know that Mrs. Williamson has been conducting surveillance on homeowners who challenge board decisions. I have photographs and time-stamped evidence of her taking pictures of residents' properties at dawn, documenting minor violations while ignoring identical issues at properties owned by board allies." She held up a folder thick with photographs showing Patricia in the act of photographing various properties, along with time-stamped evidence of the selective enforcement patterns. "I also have evidence that someone planted a fake commercial vehicle sign on my husband's truck to create a violation," Margaret continued. "This isn't about maintaining community standards. This is about a corrupt board using HOA powers to enrich family members while harassing residents who ask inconvenient questions." The meeting devolved into chaos, with homeowners shouting questions and demands while Patricia and the other board members fled toward the exit. But Margaret's public revelation had accomplished exactly what she'd intended. She'd exposed the corruption in front of the entire community and made it impossible for the board to continue operating in secret. Within hours, word had spread throughout the neighborhood. By the next morning, the local newspaper had picked up the story after multiple residents called their reporters. Within a week, the state attorney general's office had launched an investigation into HOA board corruption. But the real fireworks were yet to come because Patricia Williamson made the catastrophic mistake of thinking she could intimidate Margaret into backing down. 3 days after the explosive board meeting, Margaret received a letter from the HOA's law firm threatening a lawsuit for defamation, harassment, and malicious interference with board operations. The letter demanded that she cease all investigative activities, remove her fountain, pay all outstanding fines totaling over $800, and issue a public apology to the board members. Margaret's response, delivered through Sarah Rodriguez, was a masterpiece of legal warfare that would ultimately land them all in court for the showdown that every homeowner dreams of witnessing. Sarah Rodriguez's response to the HOA's legal threats was everything Patricia Williamson should have feared but clearly had not anticipated. Instead of backing down, Sarah filed a comprehensive federal lawsuit under the Fair Housing Act, alleging systematic discrimination, financial fraud, and civil rights violations by the HOA board. But more devastatingly, she also filed complaints with the IRS regarding potential tax fraud, the state attorney general's office regarding consumer protection violations, and local prosecutors regarding the planted commercial sign incident, which constituted criminal tampering with evidence. The lawsuit painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond petty harassment. Sarah had uncovered that over the past 5 years, Patricia Williamson's family members had received nearly $800,000 in payments from HOA funds through their various companies, while homeowners had seen their fees increase by 40%, with declining services and infrastructure maintenance. The landscaping contract alone was a masterpiece of nepotistic fraud. Patricia's nephew was being paid premium rates for services that included specialized consultation and advanced horticultural management, when in reality, he was providing basic lawn maintenance that other companies offered for half the price. Even worse, much of the work wasn't being performed at all. Invoices showed payments for services that residents could verify had never taken place. The property management contract was equally corrupt. Patricia's brother-in-law's company was charging twice the market rate while providing minimal services and ignoring resident complaints. They had also been charging administrative fees for basic services that should have been included in their base contract, generating thousands of dollars in additional revenue monthly. But the investigation revealed something even more sinister. The HOA board had been deliberately targeting residents for harassment and fines in order to force them to sell their homes, which were then purchased by Patricia's investment group at below-market prices and flipped for substantial profits. Margaret had stumbled onto a real estate scam that had been operating for years, using HOA enforcement powers as a weapon to drive down property values and create buying opportunities for the board members' financial benefit. The evidence was overwhelming, but Patricia Williamson's legal team made the catastrophic decision to fight rather than settle, apparently believing they could intimidate a retired teacher into giving up. They were spectacularly wrong. The case went to trial in October 2021, and it became a community spectacle. Local news covered the proceedings daily, and the courthouse was packed with Willowbrook Estates residents who had come to watch their former tormentors get their comeuppance. Margaret's testimony was methodical and devastating. She walked the jury through her documentation, showing photographs, financial records, and correspondence that proved systematic corruption and discriminatory enforcement. She demonstrated how violation patterns correlated directly with homeowners who had questioned board finances or challenged board decisions. But the moment everyone was waiting for came when Patricia Williamson took the stand in her own defense. Under cross-examination by Sarah Rodriguez, Patricia attempted to maintain her innocence, claiming that all board decisions were made fairly and that any financial relationships with family members were coincidental and properly disclosed. That's when Sarah introduced the evidence that had been gathered through discovery. Internal emails and text messages between board members that revealed the true scope of their conspiracy. "Mrs. Williamson," Sarah said, holding up a printed email, "would you like to explain this message you sent to Mr. Hayes, where you wrote, 'The Chen woman is becoming a problem. We need to increase pressure until she gets the message and moves on?'" Patricia's face drained of color. That was taken out of context. What about this text message to your nephew, where you wrote, 'Make sure to bill extra hours for the Chen property maintenance. We need to recoup the legal costs?'" The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of reporters' pens. "Or this email, where you discussed targeting troublemakers with increased enforcement until they sell." Patricia's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the evidence was admissible and devastating. Internal communications revealed not just financial fraud, but deliberate targeting of specific residents for harassment and economic retaliation. But the coup de grace came when Sarah presented security camera footage from a neighbor's house that showed Patricia Williamson placing the fake commercial sign on David's truck at 3:30 a.m., then returning 6 hours later to photograph the violation. The footage was crystal clear. Patricia approached the truck in the darkness, placed the magnetic sign, and then returned to document her own planted evidence. Her face was clearly visible in the neighbor's motion-activated security lighting. "Mrs. Williamson," Sarah said as the footage played on the courtroom screens, "is that you placing a fake commercial sign on my client's vehicle in order to generate a false violation?" Patricia's lawyer had clearly not been prepared for this evidence. Patricia sat in stunned silence for nearly 30 seconds before whispering, "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. By invoking the Fifth Amendment in a civil trial, Patricia was essentially admitting that her actions might have been criminal. That's when the judge, the Honorable Maria Santos, delivered the line that would become legendary in HOA litigation circles. Looking directly at Patricia Williamson, Judge Santos said, "Ma'am, I've been on this bench for 15 years, and I've heard every excuse and justification imaginable. But when someone shows me video evidence of you planting fake evidence, and then lying about it under oath, well, as Judge Judy says, don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining." The courtroom exploded in laughter, and even the bailiffs were smiling. Patricia Williamson, the woman who had terrorized an entire community with petty enforcement and arbitrary fines, had been publicly humiliated by her own actions. But Judge Santos wasn't finished. This court finds that the defendants engaged in systematic discrimination, financial fraud, and criminal evidence tampering. She continued, "The HOA board's actions constitute one of the most egregious abuses of homeowner association powers I have encountered." The judgment was swift and comprehensive. Margaret and David Chen were awarded $75,000 in compensatory damages and $200,000 in punitive damages. The HOA was ordered to refund all fees and fines collected through discriminatory enforcement, totaling over $150,000 across multiple families. Patricia Williamson, Robert Hayes, and Jennifer Martinez were ordered to resign from the board immediately and were permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. But the financial penalties were just the beginning. The IRS investigation resulted in substantial tax penalties and back payments for the unreported income from the fraudulent contracts. The State Attorney General's office filed criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. Patricia's nephew lost his landscaping license, and her brother-in-law's property management company was forced into bankruptcy. Most satisfying of all, Patricia Williamson herself faced criminal charges for evidence tampering and perjury. She ultimately pled guilty to avoid a lengthy prison sentence, but was sentenced to 2 years probation, 400 hours of community service, and substantial fines. The aftermath was equally dramatic. The Willowbrook Estates HOA was placed under state supervision, while a new board was elected and new management was hired. The community's fees were reduced by 30% once the corrupt contracts were eliminated, and common area maintenance actually improved under honest management. The most important outcome was the change in state law that resulted from Margaret's case. The legislature passed the Homeowner Protection Act, which established strict oversight requirements for HOA boards, mandated conflict of interest disclosures, and created whistleblower protections for residents who report board misconduct. Margaret Chen became something of a folk hero in HOA reform circles. She was invited to speak at state legislative hearings, wrote articles for homeowner advocacy publications, and consulted with attorneys handling similar cases across the country. The little fountain that started the final confrontation? It still sits by the Chen's mailbox, a 28-inch symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to be intimidated by petty tyrants. When asked about her advice for homeowners facing similar situations, Margaret's response was characteristically direct. Document everything, know your rights, and never let bullies convince you that their power is absolute. Sometimes the people who seem the most intimidating are actually the most vulnerable because their authority depends entirely on other people's willingness to be intimidated. David Chen, meanwhile, had his own perspective on their 3-year ordeal. We learned that corruption thrives in the shadows and dies in the light. The moment Margaret started asking questions publicly and demanding transparency, their whole house of cards started falling down. The Willowbrook Estates community today is a very different place. Property values have actually increased since the corrupt board was removed. Community satisfaction is at an all-time high. And the monthly board meetings are well attended by residents who now understand the importance of oversight and accountability. Patricia Williamson moved away from the community in early 2022, selling her house at a significant loss due to the ongoing legal proceedings and public scandal. Local real estate agents report that she was desperate to leave and accepted the first offer she received, ironically experiencing the same economic pressure she had inflicted on other residents for years. But the most telling epilogue to this story came from an unexpected source. 6 months after the trial concluded, Margaret received a handwritten letter from Jennifer Martinez, the former board member who had fled the explosive community meeting. In the letter, Jennifer apologized for her role in the harassment and explained that she had been intimidated by Patricia into going along with the targeting and financial improprieties. She revealed that several other board members over the years had been similarly manipulated or pressured into compliance, creating a culture of fear and corruption that extended far beyond what the trial had revealed. "I was afraid of her," Jennifer wrote. Patricia had a way of making you believe that she could destroy your life in the community if you didn't cooperate. But watching you stand up to her showed me that bullies only have the power we give them. Today, Margaret Chen still lives in Willowbrook Estates, where she serves as an elected member of the reformed HOA board. Her first act in office was to establish a transparent complaint process and regular financial audits, ensuring that what happened to her family could never happen again. She keeps a framed copy of Judge Santos's judgment in her home office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what's possible when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. The fountain still runs every day, its gentle bubbling a peaceful counterpoint to the chaos it once represented. Neighbors often stop to admire it, and Margaret always tells them the same thing. It's just a fountain, but it represents something much more important, the principle that no one should have to live in fear in their own home. And for those of you watching who might be facing your own HOA nightmares, remember Margaret's story. Sometimes the people who seem the most powerful are actually the most vulnerable. And sometimes a retired teacher with a camera and the courage to ask questions can bring down an entire network of corruption. The question isn't whether you have the power to fight back, it's whether you dare to use it. What would you have done in Margaret's situation? Let me know in the comments below, and remember, tyranny flourishes when good people do nothing, but it crumbles when even one person decides to stand up and say enough.